So the story that I picked was called The Wind in the Willows. Some of you might have heard of it. Some of you might have not. It's a storybook about a few animals. They go on an adventure, right? And the character I wanted to focus on tonight was, or for some people this morning, wherever time zone you're in, is Mr. Toad, right? He's this guy right here. And so I kind of wanted to walk you through my process of gathering reference, sketching, and then taking a character all the way to final. So the first thing I do is I gather reference, and I kind of split my reference gathering into a few different sections, right? So the first section is, what reference do I need to really know about the subject? And our subject is Mr. Toad. We know he's a toad. So I went and gathered a bunch of different reference of toads. I was looking for interesting poses, interesting anatomy, shapes, colors, just trying to really learn about this animal and how I'm going to caricature it and how I'm going to turn it into a character, right? So that's kind of the first step I always do is what things do I really need to learn and know about the character as a species, or if they are human, maybe that's that nationality or race or culture, right? And then the next step is I gather reference for the actual character, right? So in the book, we read that Mr. Toad is obsessed with having the newest, coolest, fastest things. He's reckless and breaks everything he touches. He's very wealthy. He lacks humility and self-control. He's boastful. So I always list out kind of the important facts about the character, right? What do we know about the character, who he is? And then I start to gather reference that can help me create ideas, right? So some things I think of are like costuming, right? So I have these gloves. Let's see, what layer is that on? These driving gloves, he loves to race and he likes to drive fast boats and cars. So, driving gloves might be an idea. The time period, right? So I decided to kind of keep with the same time period that the original story was, the early 1900s, right? So, I found lots of different suits, and I really like these hats that they're wearing, right? And I love this kind of plaid color, so maybe I'm thinking of that later on. The other thing that I do is I find actors in movies or TV shows that I feel like could portray this character, right? And so for this character, I was looking for kind of crazy, wealthy, and reckless, right? And so some of you guys might recognize some of these characters. And sometimes these characters get caricatured into the character. Sometimes I just use them for poses or expressions to kind of give my character life, right? And using real world examples. The other thing that I find is kind of maybe work that inspires me. So I'm a big fan of Ronald Searle. You can see, these drawings down here. And so I like to always put those up on my mood board, kind of keep me inspired. Kind of think of, okay, if this went into the Searle world, what it would look like. And then, of course, I wanted to see some of the classic drawings of this character that are already done. So, this one down here was done from the Disney movie that had Mr. Toad in it. And then this is one from the classic book, right? And a lot of times I like to see what's already been done so that I can, for one, kind of avoid some of the ideas that have already been done, but as well as see maybe things that I want to keep classic in my character, like this kind of coat and costume that he has. And then lastly, I like to find things that are just kind of out of pocket, just something that attracts me and I want to incorporate in my character. So that's kind of what these two images are. I love their eyes. I love the crazy look, right? So these are kind of things that maybe don't relate to the time period or the animal or anything like that. Just images that is going to make this character unique or give it personality, right? So that's kind of the first step that I take is gathering reference, creating a mood board, and staying inspired. I think the most important thing when preparing for a character design, especially for a job, is to make sure you're going to have enough material to keep you inspired to keep drawing and creating ideas. The next phase I kind of go into, and I would have done this part tonight, but I just didn't know, how long we would take. So I am going to draw for you guys tonight, but I did do some initial sketches first to kind of show you quickly how I get to that final process. So I go right in and I do some rough sketches, right? There was more than just these 5, a lot of really loose ones, really rough ones, but I'm trying to explore different shapes, right? And different things that I pull from my reference. When I'm doing these, I really like to start with just big shapes. So like this one right here, for example, I was really kind of thinking of that triangle motif, right? Danger, triangle. And I start with big shapes and I build on top of that. I start loose, right? This one over here, I kept a little more rounder, a little bit more sly and kind of softer. Down here, you can kind of see where those bug eyes kind of came into play, right? So I go through this kind of initial sketch process, and then I pick my favorite, and I start exploring that one favorite for a little bit. All right. And if any of you guys have ever took in Brooklyn Walker's class, she talks a lot about this this idea of doing a lot of different variations, right? So this is all my characters, one like this, like this, like this, and then picking a favorite and then exploring it even more, right? And you can do that with a few characters, right? And just changing little things, but getting lots of different variations. So this is kind of how this one started out, right? You had these long legs, big body. Then I said, let's try a different pose. Let's kind of see what he'd look like more stretched out and give him a different look. And then I said, let's maybe give him a more stocky look. When I think of toads, if we go back to my reference, these toads kind of have a thicker feel to it rather than like a frog. A frog is kind of more long and skinny and dynamic, and a toad is kind of more thick and I think of heavy. So I wanted to give him a more heavier look. And then I was messing with the hands a little bit. I started with these kind of big gloves. Oops. Started with these big gloves on him, and then kind of said, no, let's go back to the skinnier, the littler driving gloves. And then ended up on a completely different hand pose and using those even smaller hands, right? And so, okay, so this is kind of the phase that I get to. And if I was working for a client, I would probably take most of, these ones, clean them up a little bit, show them to the client, see which ones they want me to then dive further into. And then I'll take up my favorite one and really clean it up. And that's kind of what I want to demo for you guys today, is how I kind of work this character into the next step, how to continue to breathe life into a character and keep that loose feeling, keep them feeling alive, right? So let's do this. So if any of you guys are familiar with my work, I like brushes that do have that inky feeling that you can get a thin and a thick line to. The new update for Procreate, if any of you guys are on Procreate, has a really cool brush called Shearwater that I've been using a lot recently. But I thought for today that I would just kind of use the classic brush that I normally use, and it's just an ink brush that I tapered to give it a thin and thick working brush likeness to it. And when I approach these, I try and keep the looseness in the sketch, but bring something new to it as well, right? So I'm thinking, how can I make this better, but still keep that loose feeling to it? Right? And then kind of being selective with where I put those thin and thick lines, right? I think a lot of times I like to have these thicker lines on the bottom half, of things, almost like a shadow. And I did want to kind of keep those kind of that triangle, dangerous shape in here, even though I made him a little bit more rounder. So I decided to really keep that collar kind of sharp. And sometimes I like to go back and pull through some of these older ones that I had. Where were these? And maybe I want to try like these eyes on him, these bigger eyes. So then I'd go in, and maybe I try these big eyes, right? See what I think of those real quick. And yeah, they're fun, but I think for what I'm trying to accomplish, they might not do the trick. So yeah, so I was just saying was to kind of be thinking about those expressions and shapes and poses in your character. One thing that I kind of have been battling back and forth this is as a character designer for a long time. It is shape language. When I first kind of started learning character design, shape language was something that was kind of confusing to me. They always teach, you have a square that means this and a triangle that means this. And I kind of got stuck only using those shapes in my characters, and all my characters kind of looked like, I have a round character, or I have a triangle character, or I have a square character, right? And all my characters ended up looking like this, and I kind of got stuck in that mindset. And of course, there's times where those kind of characters are for sure doable and fine. We think of movies like Up or Inside Out, where they are very strong shapes. But something that I kind of figured out was to kind of think of shape language in a more abstract way. And as you're designing with shapes, how do those specific shapes make you feel? This character, I wanted a bigger, heavier feeling, but to still keep him feeling, crazy at the same time. And so as I was kind of designing him, I was trying to think, I don't want to just go with a triangle or a big square. I need to, really think about how to combine those shapes into something a little bit more um, lifelike, or something you could believe.
So there's a question from Phil. Um, in our portfolio, should we present the process that led us to the creation of the characters?
Yes, I would suggest in a portfolio you have process, sketches, finished pieces, turnarounds, pretty much everything in the process, right? In my portfolio, I like to have early sketches and exploration, and then showing, what came next, right? And a lot of studios and companies, they want to see how you think. They want to see, of course, see how you draw, but a big thing is how you're thinking when they give you a job or something. They want to know how you're going to think, and showing process work and sketches is a big help for that. So hopefully that answers your question. So
Yeah, that
yeah.
answers your question. All right. Um, Next is Richie's question. What do studios specially look for in a portfolio, especially if you are in still college and looking for an internship?
Yeah, so if you're looking for an internship, they're of course not going to expect a portfolio that's the same level as a professional. But at the same time, a lot of the internships, at least here in America, are very competitive. And so the better your portfolio, the better your chances are. And I would say what they're looking for is kind of what I was just talking about. Seeing how you think. They want to see if you're able to think through problems and be a problem solver. Working in animation, especially in the visual development department, you got to think of yourself kind of as a problem solver, not just an artist, right? They're going to give you a problem, like for example, they need a character that is a centaur or some kind of mythical creature and looks very mean but has a kind fatherly personality. So they want to see, okay, how does this artist think and how are they going to solve that problem? And the best things you can put in your portfolio for that are just, you're showing how you work through ideas, how your character sketches go, what they look like, and you're even showing reference sometimes in your portfolio can be good on a if you guys have like a project page specifically for projects that you work on, personal projects, showing your reference can be super helpful for people looking at your portfolio, seeing how you think and how you pick your reference. But I think also showing that you have technical skills and draftsmanship is super important as well, meaning that you do life drawing, you do you sketch at cafes in your sketchbook, you can do turnarounds, you can put characters in a pose sheet that are really nice and refined. All those things are also very important, showing that you know how to draw as well.
All right. I hope that answers your question, Richie. Yeah, perfect. There's a question from Gayatri. Are props always necessary to give purpose to the characters? How do we present a character in our portfolio apart from dynamic poses?
Yeah. As so to the prop thing, no, I think props aren't always needed. Like this Mr. Toad character, I didn't give him any props for this specifically. I think props can be helpful, especially when trying to show, like story, especially when you start putting characters in story poses and things like that. Giving props can help the story. As for how to kind of present a character besides just classic, poses and stuff, if that's what you meant, I think you could present a character in a portfolio in a lot of different ways. You can do it through exploration sketches, story sketches. I think story sketches is one of the most um, important things to have in a portfolio as well. Kind of showing that, especially if you're trying to work in animation, showing as well that you can put the character into a story and have them acting or relating with another character as well. That can be super helpful for recruiters looking through your portfolio. So, besides just the classic, putting character in a bunch of poses and putting them in your portfolio, putting them in story moments can be super helpful as well.
All right. I hope, Gayatri, that answers your question. By the way, Parker, we cannot see you. Did you turn off your camera?
Yeah, so with my when I share my screen, it
Hmm.
won't let me share my camera as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
yeah, so as
You
long as you can
working
see
on
my screen.
iPad?
Yeah, working on iPad.
Hmm. Got it. Yeah, that happens working with iPad.
Yeah, I tried to get it to work earlier today, but couldn't get it to work.
All right. Um, Question from Priyanka. Are you open to one-on-one mentorship for character design? Yes, we are actually bringing up after this.
Yeah, we're gonna do a 5 week mentorship coming up, and um, we'll talk kind of about the whole process of character design and kind of building a little portfolio project. As for one
Yeah.
on one, I mean, we'll definitely kind of I'll give you guys feedback in the 5 week mentorship. But if you're looking for something more one on one, I can for sure, we can work something out too as well with that. But yeah, the 5 week
Yeah.
mentorship should be super informative, super fun, and hopefully by the end of it, you guys will have some portfolio pieces.
Yeah. We will also gonna share the insights about the 5 week program later in this class. All right, so there's another question. Wait, guys. Okay. Sanvi, any tips for line art? That's where I struggle a lot.
Yeah, line art. Line art's one of my favorite things, so I got lots of
Yeah.
tips for it. I think one of the biggest tips is to just make sure you get that line variety. So, for example, you have thin lines to thick lines, back to thin, right? And if this is a struggle for you, I would do practices every day of just kind of like this, doing S's and tapering, doing straight lines, right? And then when you apply it to your drawing, kind of just be thinking about, what kind of things do you want to stand out in your drawing? So, for example, the eyes, I always kind of give a thicker line on the top of the eyes. I always give thick lines, like I said kind of earlier, to the bottoms of things. So, like where there would maybe be a shadow. So, on the bottom of this pant cuff, maybe I make it a little thicker right there, kind of to imply that there's a shadow right there. And then you can also just put it places that maybe you feel would benefit from thick lines, like the bow tie could maybe have a little thickness up top. Another thing that I do is I'll go back in and I'll actually erase back part of my lines to make them even thinner in some places. Sometimes I get kind of carried away with where I'm putting the thick lines. And so I like to go back in and kind of erase. And that can be helpful too if you feel like all of your lines are a bit too even. So, like with this circle, like this, if you just drew a big circle, you feel like all your lines are a little bit too even, you could go back in and just kind of erase some of those back, just some parts to kind of give it a more loose feel. Another big tip that I did a lot, that I still do, is do master copies of artists that have great line work. So, like people like Ronald Searle or Quentin Blake, people that have a really nice line that you want to mimic. Just take some time every day and practice copying their work, and then eventually you'll kind of learn what they're doing, and you can implement it into your own work.
Okay. Guys, we'll take only one question from one person. So please do not uh, give multiple questions one after other. As an experienced freelancer, how do you find new clients for freelancing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Social media, like Instagram, has been my best friend when it comes to finding clients. Most of the people that have hired me said that they found me on Instagram. So if you have an Instagram account, make sure you're posting on it. Make sure that you're kind of treating it almost as a second job. That's how I kind of like to think about it. Every day I'm kind of on Instagram. I'm liking posts. I'm following people that I think could be useful to follow. And I'm posting. I try and post weekly if I can. If I'm really busy, I of course sometimes miss, but especially when you're in the process of looking for work, posting on Instagram can be super helpful. Along with connecting with people. Like I said, emailing out, just asking people questions or letting them know how much you enjoy their work. Just a short email even can help you make friends down the road. But as for freelance, social media, and applying to just jobs in general, if you see a job on LinkedIn, apply for it, and maybe somebody there will see your work, and you won't get the job right away, but you'll then be on a, a list to hire next time, right? So yeah.
All right, we'll resume uh, remaining questions in a while.
So something else that I like to do um, is kind of just find spots and add little lines and different things. I like to use this little the smudge tool, and I like to kind of give us sometimes a little smeared effect. This kind of, I feel like it gives my drawings a more traditional feel, a little bit more life. I try and keep that loose. I try and keep the looseness the best I can, but at the same time keep it finished feeling at the same time. It's always been something as I was in school trying to figure out is how can I get a loose feel and a more traditional look digitally. I love working traditionally with real ink and watercolor. And so when I decided to work digitally, I wanted to figure out a way that worked out well for me. And a lot of the times this kind of this stuff is experimental, adding the the ink splats and the smudges. I just kind of there's no really rhyme or reason to it. I just kind of go in and put it where I want to kind of draw the eye to, and if I don't like it, I erase it. But yeah, the ink splats is another thing that I use a lot of. Kind of gives a little texture to to the piece, and yeah, I normally just use the classic ink splats that come with Procreate. Nothing fancy. And sometimes I'll make my own with my brush if I can't find a pattern that I like. Maybe there's flies around him since he's a toad, even though these are little big flies, but maybe not. But yeah, so after the line work, normally I go into color. And depending on the project will kind of depend on what coloring style I use. If it's just my own stuff, or a lot of times what clients want is the watercolor look that I do. So that's what I'm going to do tonight for you guys. Kind of show you how I watercolor one of these digitally. But yeah, what I'm doing right now is this is kind of the finishing touches of line work that I like to do. Keeps the drawing feeling inky and loose and alive. Just making sure, everything's working. Putting some stray lines places. Make it feel energetic. All right, maybe some more up here. All right, so when I go into color, I like to kind of experiment to see what colors I want to do before I just start laying down. So I use this big flat brush, and I kind of zoom out a little bit. And something I love is creating color palettes. You can do it on Photoshop, you can do it in Procreate, you can do it traditionally. I like to, just in my free time, I like to try and create cohesive color palettes, something that kind of feels like these colors all go together, and then use it for pieces. It just kind of helps the colors all feel the same and cohesive. So this is one of my favorites that I just created. You can pull them from movies, you can pull them from artwork you like, and then just experiment. Of course, sometimes I'll click on a color, and if I don't like that exact hue or saturation, I'll change it up, but for the most part, I just try and stick with these that you know, a different palette, whatever I'd like. Going back to the reference real quick, I really like this one right here, this kind of reddish, brownish yellow, rather than the classic green. So I think I'm going to try and do something with that. So let's see. Let's kind of just experiment real quick. I normally, when I put in these color blocks, oh man, sorry, they're super rough, and I'm just trying to see from a distance if it's working, you know, going down different colors. Maybe the suit will be this color. Maybe the eyes. I like those popping green. This is normally how I do rough colors on most things, just kind of blobs of color. Kind of quickens the process rather than tediously changing the colors as I'm going. So yeah, so with that I can kind of see, yeah, I like where that's going. I like this color palette that I'm using, so I think I'll use that. So then what I'll do is I'll kind of make this a little smaller, put it up to the corner for kind of a reference for later. And then I like the Max Pack watercolors. They are, I feel like, the closest to real watercolors. And then something else I also like to do a lot of times is put down a almost like an underpainting. And I'll normally just, this kind of also helps the colors feel more cohesive. And it also kind of, I can kind of, with the watercolor, change how dark places are, by how hard I press. So I like to kind of go down lower with the darks, and then as it gets up here, keep it a little lighter. This will also help because I can make a clipping mask of this and then paint right over the top of it. So yeah, so then I just erase back. When I was in school and started working some with digital, I always struggled with color digitally. There's always so many colors to choose from that sometimes a lot of times my pieces and characters felt kind of like everyone was a rainbow of colors. Because traditionally, I mean, you have limited colors. You're either limited to what you own in tubes of paint or of what you put on your palette. And so you've always kind of working with the limited palette when we're working traditionally. And I always loved that. And so as I was transitioning into digital more, I tried to mimic that. And that's kind of where creating palettes came into key, and also using these kind of underpaintings. And I'll do the same thing sometimes as an overpainting and kind of glaze the image with the color as well to keep it cohesive. And colors can also tell stories. I think with the red, it kind of keeps with the story of he's kind of, a hothead, right? These kind of warmer colors. So with the clipping mask, I can just go right over this orange. And sometimes the problem with the clipping mask is you don't quite get the saturation you want. And so I'll have to go right over top and kind of work it again. But normally I'm just working back and forth between a few layers of color to kind of try and find what I like. Oops. I'll kind of go back and forth creating different clipping masks of color. Of course, you don't have to do the clipping mask thing. You can always just work right on top. Nice thing about a clipping mask is I won't go outside the lines when I color on top. And with the clipping mask, you can kind of create nice gradients. So now that I have this red, I can go in with some of that brown that we were seeing on the frog in the reference and kind of create this gradient. I'll go in with that smudge tool again and kind of push those colors around. Sometimes it kind of ruins the watercolor texture, but sometimes it's kind of nice to move those around. Oops, why it keeps doing that. I'm thinking I want to, let's see back on that. Oops. Let's bring this reference up here. So it looks like, let's try and bring in some of those yellows, maybe, for his, those freckles or those warts. And a lot of times when I color things, it kind of looks and starts off pretty chaotic, but gotta just trust the process and it'll all work out. Really like those green eyes, so let's go with that. Let's make them a little bit brighter. I think the face of a character is always a good focal point to have. So if you can create contrast in the face somehow, draw the viewer's eye there. It's always a good idea.
Any ask when designing a cast of characters, can you talk more about exploring facial expressions, distinct poses for each one, getting more into design and personality?
Yeah. So when designing a cast of characters, I guess we can start with that. I think one of the most important things is getting a variety of shapes and sizes, creating a lineup. You want, everybody in the lineup to kind of feel like they're its own person and to have good contrast. I want everybody to have contrast, meaning they're different shapes, different sizes, and they all feel different. When it comes to exploring facial expressions, kind of like with with how I was talking about finding reference earlier, using actors. I think using actors to find facial expressions is super helpful when I'm creating expression sheets, or even just expressions on characters that I'm posing. I'm always looking at actors and how they express, right? So if we want to look at this reference that I pulled in down here, these references from Leonardo DiCaprio are great. If your character is a similar character to him in this film, or as any of these guys that I have pulled up, the crazy look in their eyes and stuff, you can use that and try and put that into your character when you're creating your expressions, right? So I think that's one of the best things and biggest tips is use actors, use a reference of yourself too, I'm always taking photos of myself to try and get good reference for expressions.
All right. Uh, if your 5 week program, will you be teaching character design from beginning?
What was that? One more time.
Yeah. Like she's asking, in this 5 week program, will you be teaching character design from the beginning?
Yeah. So, kind of, if we want to talk a little bit about the 5 week course, just briefly, how it's going to go is we'll start. So each week we'll focus on something new. It'll all be character design, and we'll all be part of the same kind of. Everybody will pick their own story that they kind of want to build characters for. If you want to make up your own story, you can. But we'll create a lineup. We'll talk about exploration. We'll talk about, real, like you asked from the beginning. Yes, we'll talk about the very beginnings of creating a character, things to think about, and how to explore personality and shapes, and then we'll talk about refining that character with through poses and expressions. We'll talk a little bit about turnarounds, and yeah, we'll try and cover all the basics of kind of a character designer and building some portfolio pieces.
So the next one is from Purva. What would you recommend including in a portfolio when applying for internship programs at big studios like DreamWorks or Disney?
Yeah, so with the big studios, of course, I think to you don't want to, of course, copy their style, right? You don't want to have a bunch. If you're applying to Disney, you don't want to just draw Disney stuff, but it is also important to think about what is their um, house style. So when I look at a lot of the DreamWorks movies that are coming out right now, a lot of their stuff is more on the realistic side, or not necessarily realistic, but not as pushed as, let's say, Pixar. So if you're trying to apply to a studio like Pixar or DreamWorks, make sure you're looking at what kind of stuff they are currently doing, and then try and have your style somewhat aligned to that. Not saying to copy their style, but just like how pushed are their characters, or how anatomically correct is their stuff. So I think that's one thing to think about when applying to those big studios. Like of course somebody's portfolio that's meant for Disney TV probably isn't going to get them a job at let's say Leica, or somewhere that's like stop motion and more grungy kind of looking. So kind of think about, what kind of style that studio has, and you can make a bunch of different projects fitting different styles in your portfolio as well. If you kind of want to work for all studios, it's good to have a lot of different kind of styles in your portfolio. I try and have like three different kind of styles ish in my portfolio. One that's super pushed and simple, one that's a little bit more realistic, and then one that's kind of more my classic look of how I like to draw things. And things to include, kind of just like what we said earlier, is just kind of all the basics. You want to have some turnarounds in there. You want to have some character exploration. You really want to, like we've talked about, show how you're thinking. So that means having sketchbook pages. Um, and look at past interns' portfolios. When I was applying to internships and stuff, I would always look at who got that internship last year and what does their portfolio look like, and that kind of shows you what the studio is looking for. And I would even go as far as saying, when applying to even just internships, to look at professional character designers that work there, what their portfolio looks like too, right? So if you're applying to Pixar, maybe look at Chris Sasaki's portfolio, or Deanna Marsaglisi's portfolio. um, People like that work there, have the job, what kind of work they do, I think is super helpful to kind of tailor your stuff like they are. And of course, I'm not saying to copy that. I'm just saying it kind of gives you an idea of what the studio is looking for. And at the end of the day, you know, if you're a good character designer and you are, you know, showing your own voice, then you'll get work. I think that's another kind of thing that not a lot of people talk about is you need to be unique, right? You need to draw the way you like to draw and kind of show a studio, you know, why should they hire you? What are you bringing to the table? Because if you just draw like every artist, if you just have a copied style, then they'll just hire that artist. You know, you need to give them a reason to hire you specifically. And that's something that I've always tried to, you know, gotten as I've been learning more and more, you know, with working and stuff, I try and create stuff to show this is who I am, this is how I draw, this is what I can bring to the table. That makes sense.
All right. Mm, when we are aiming for portfolio for character design and prop, should we include background, landscape, city escapes, etc.?
That's a great question. That's actually a question I used to always ask whenever I would,
Hmm.
you know, talk to people. And I think there's a few different answers. I think that pick a thing you love and do it. So if you love characters and you don't love drawing backgrounds, then don't draw backgrounds because your backgrounds will not be as good as your characters, and that will show in your portfolio. I do, however, think that it's important that you do show that you can do some of that stuff. So, for example, in my portfolio, I have my character design work, and in some of my character design works, I put my characters in an illustration that has a background. I'm not necessarily doing specifically background work and putting in my portfolio, but when you look at my character design portfolio, I have characters in backgrounds and just a few, right? Just to show you know how to create a complete picture. But if you want to be a background artist, do backgrounds. If you want to do character design, do character designs and get really good at that specific thing. That's what I would suggest because it's going to be really hard to be, you know, good at everything. You're not going to have all the time in the world. Now, of course, you can, if you start working and you want to kind of transition, yeah, you experiment. If you want to, if you're a storyboard artist and all of a sudden you kind of want to get into character design, keep your storyboard work in your portfolio and then start, you know, learning character design. But when starting out, I would suggest pick something and get really good at it and learn everything you can about it.
And also, do you think like learning 2D is enough, or uh, would it gonna be a best advice to go with 3D as well if anyone wishes to go for character design? Mat- Means if they're applying for the character design,
Yeah,
would they
I think
have to? Mhm.
I think learning both is important. You know,
Yeah.
most if you're trying to work for feature film, of course,
Hmm.
3D is what it's going to be most of the time. But I think having, you know, some 2D work as well shows that you can do both, right? You can do CG 3D work, and you can do 2D. And as on top of that, as a character designer, having actual 3D work in your portfolio shows that you can work with the modelers down the pipeline, right? So as you are designing characters, as the modelers start modeling, you can you can be helpful on that. And I think if you look at my portfolio right now, I have some sculptures, some digital. So they're not digital; they're traditional, but they're sculpts that I did. And it kind of just shows that I know how to think in 3D. I know how you know all of that works, how to translate something into 3D.
What are the key questions you ask your client to clearly understand their vision and requirement for a character design process? Okay.
When I do a job or a client, a lot of times they'll send me some of my work that I've done that they like, and they're like, we want you to work. This is the stuff we like that you've done, work in this style. Um, or they'll give me, of course, like I worked on a recent production, and they had created a mood board already. I was working kind of just creating characters for a pitch, so it was really early in the production, but they had created a mood board and it had lots of reference of what they were looking for. But if they ever lack reference, some things that I think about when asking is, what, how push do you want this? How realistic? What kind of what's it for? Is it for 2D, 3D? Who's the audience? Knowing the audience is always important, in especially in illustration. You got to know who's reading this or who's going to see this, who's this going to be bought and by, right? That's always an important thing to know. So yeah, kind of who the audience is, how pushed you want it. If there's examples, I love asking for specific examples of work that they like and that they kind of want it to resemble.
All right. So there's one more question. How to maintain the design language when characters of different personalities and the weights are seen in the same story? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So um, that can be tricky sometimes for sure. So when creating a lineup or you're creating more characters that are part of the same world, I think it's important to really kind of keep your eye on specifically what makes that character's design the way it is, whether that's straight and curves or that's proportions, right? When you look at so let's go with an example of Up, kind of like we talked about earlier, the movie Up by Pixar. All of those characters are very pushed design, shape wise, and that's kind of their design language. I think if you're designing your own characters and you're trying to keep them cohesive, it can help to kind of make a design bible or something that's going to give you some rules, right? So if you have a rule that all of your arms on all your characters have very strong straights and curves to them. So for example, if your arms are going to look like have one straight and a curve on them, right? And that's what your arms want to look like, keep that cohesive throughout all. If you're using big shapes for characters, right? Let's say like this guy, don't have a character that's then all of a sudden, going to be super realistic, right? And have like super correct anatomy. That's not going to fit in the same world. If you're going to have somebody, more skinny, use a skinny rectangle or some other shape if you're going to go more shape wise. And I think at the end of the day, something important too is to put your characters next to each other, you know, and do they ask yourself, does this feel like it belongs in this world? Could these characters live together in the same movie? And when you put them next to each other, if they don't feel that way, then you got some work to do. You got to figure out what designs um, design elements make that character feel the way it does.
I think animation industry always need an exaggeration of characters instead of drawing a very stiff pose or something, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So exaggerating is always
Mm,
important. And I think a lot of people, the classic thing you hear is, push it until you break it, meaning that with your posing and your character shapes and proportions, just keep pushing that until it all of a sudden doesn't work. And then you can dial back. But a lot of times to find those fun looking characters, you got to kind of keep pushing yourself, keep exaggerating until until it doesn't work anymore. And that way you can figure out what does work and what doesn't. This is kind of the usual when I take a character all the way to color. This is normally how the process goes. I think I'm going to add just a few more things on his jacket, though. I do like to kind of try and find ways to vary the color. Kind of zoom out and see if everything's working on him. See if there's anything I need to touch up. Yeah, and then sometimes I feel like his colors are pretty cohesive here, but kind of a trick that I do sometimes if I feel like my colors aren't very cohesive. So I'll just create another layer, and then let's pick a color. Let's go with like a blue. I'll just throw a color on top, and then put this to different kind of different color blending modes and see if I like any of these, right? You know, that one might be cool. And that one's cool. That one's not bad. Some of them, like this one, like I'd never use. Some of them have a cool effect. And then, you know, if I let's say I liked one, like say I liked this one or something, I could even go back in and then start erasing parts out that I want to be back to that original color. Like you can see the line work kind of gets taken over too by some of that color. But yeah, and then just, you know, different places. I don't know if I want to put that on this one. You know, it might be kind of cool on the bottom, but not on the top. If anything, I'll turn it down a little bit. Yeah. Oh well. All right. So yeah, that's probably it for this guy. So we can do, let's see what time it is. We can do a few more questions and then
Yeah.
probably call it a night. Let me stop sharing my screen real quick.